Welcome to the Explainer. Look, if you're gearing up for the Queensland bar exams, you know procedure isn't just trivia, it's what wins cases. So today, we're going to jump right into Chapter 7 of the Uniform Civil Procedure Rules on Disclosure. But we're not just going to read it. We're going to turn it into a practical, powerful toolkit you can rely on for your exams and, for your entire career.
All right, let's get right into it. When you're studying for your exams, please don't look at Chapter 7 as some dense, boring set of rules. You got to see it for what it is. It's your toolkit. It's your arsenal. Knowing exactly which tool to pull out and when to use it, well, that's what makes a barrister truly effective. So let's break down how to master it.
So, what's actually in this toolkit? Well, first we'll cover preliminary disclosure. Then we'll get into the real workhorse, party disclosure. After that, we'll check out some specialized tools, things like interrogatories and non-party disclosure. And then we'll wrap it all up with a final check to make sure it's all locked in.
Okay, first up, your pre-litigation tools. These come from Part 1 of Chapter 7. Think of these as your intelligence-gathering instruments. You use them before a proceeding is even started. And here is a massive tip for your exam. As of 2024, remember, these rules now apply in all Queensland courts, not just the Supreme Court. That's a big change.
So, Part 1 gives you two very distinct tools. Honestly, the easiest way to remember this for the exam is to think who versus if. Simple as that. Over on the left, you've got Rule 28C. You use that to find out who to sue. You've got a solid case, but you literally don't know who the defendant is. Then on the right, you have Rule 28D. This is for when you're trying to decide if you should sue. You know who the defendant is, but you need some key documents to figure out if you've got a viable case. That's it. Rule 28C is for who, Rule 28D is for if.
So how do you actually use these tools? Well, the process for both Rule 208C and 208D is basically these 4 steps. You file an application, you back it up with a supporting affidavit, and then you serve it personally. But step 4, this is the one they'll try to catch you on in the exam. Because there's no existing case, you must use an originating application. Don't forget that.
Okay, so the claim is filed, the pleadings are happening. Now we get to the heartland of Chapter 7. This is your main everyday tool, the duty of disclosure between the parties. You'll find it all in Part 2. This is really the bedrock of the whole system, making sure everyone knows the case they're up against.
Now, the entire duty of disclosure really comes down to this one test in Rule 211. You absolutely have to memorize this exact phrase. A document must be directly relevant to an allegation in issue. Notice how specific that is. It's a pretty narrow test. It's not about documents that just kind of relate to the case. No, it has to tie directly to a specific point that's being argued in the pleadings. And of course, it only applies to documents your client actually has in their possession or control.
And here's the other crucial takeaway from Rule 211. Disclosure is not a one-time thing. It's not like you just dump your documents and you're done. As the rule says, it is a continuing obligation. So if a brand new, directly relevant document lands on your client's desk 6 months into the case, that duty to disclose it kicks in right away. This is a super common exam topic, so make sure you've got that locked in.
So what about timing? Under Rule 214, the clock starts ticking the moment the pleadings are considered closed. And from that point, you have exactly 28 days to get your list of documents served on the other side. It's simple, it's clear, and it is a deadline you really don't want to miss.
All right, let's do a quick fire round of some key rules from Part 2 that are just prime material for exam questions. First, Rule 226. The solicitor has to sign a certificate saying they've explained the duty of disclosure to their client. Second, Rule 221. Remember that documents about damages are only disclosed if the other side specifically asks for them. Third, and this is a big one, Rule 212. Expert reports are not privileged from disclosure. And finally, Rule 225, which gives the court some serious teeth. If you fail to disclose, they can strike out your entire case.
Okay, let's move on. Sometimes just having the documents doesn't quite paint the whole picture, right? That's when you need to reach for a couple of the more specialized instruments in your Chapter 7 toolkit. We're talking about interrogatories for asking direct questions and non-party disclosure for when you need to get documents from people who aren't even in the case.
So interrogatories are basically written questions you can serve on another party. But, and this is a big but, you can't just fire them off whenever you feel like it. You need the court's permission.
you need leave. And the court will only grant it if it's convinced there's no other reasonably simple and inexpensive way to prove whatever you're trying to prove. Even then, you're usually capped at 30 questions. The courts keep a really tight leash on this one. Okay, so what happens when a crucial document is being held by an outsider, say a bank or an accountant? That's when you pull out your non-party disclosure tool, which is in Part 3. The process is all laid out here. You issue and serve a Form 21 notice, and you've got to do it within 3 months. Notice the test is exactly the same, directly relevant. The non-party then gets 14 days to produce the documents, but here's the critical bit for your exam. They only have 7 days to object, and if they object, the whole process is put on hold. Those are tight deadlines.
So there we have it. We've basically unpacked the entire toolbox. Before we wrap this up, let's do one final check of the key instruments we've talked about in Chapter 7. Think of this as your high-level summary, just to help lock this whole framework in your mind before the exam. So here it is, your complete UCPR disclosure toolkit on one slide. You've got preliminary disclosure in Part 1 for that pre-litigation intelligence. Then you have the absolute workhorse, disclosure between parties in Part 2, all governed by that crucial, directly relevant test from Rule 211. Also in Part 2, you have the precision tool of interrogatories. And finally, non-party disclosure in Part 3 for getting what you need from outsiders.
At the end of the day, mastering Chapter 7 isn't just about memorizing rule numbers. It's about thinking on your feet. When you're looking at an exam problem, you have to ask yourself, what stage is this case at? What is the one piece of information I desperately need? And which of these tools is the right one for this exact job? That's how you really master this stuff. Okay, that's all for this explainer. Good luck with your preparation.